Here is something your database is doing right now that almost nobody who uses it knows about. When you change a row in Postgres, the old one does not go anywhere. Postgres does not reach into the table and overwrite it. It writes a brand new copy of that row a little further down and leaves the old one sitting exactly where it was. Your database is not a whiteboard that gets wiped and rewritten. It is a stack of every version of every row piling up quietly underneath you. That one design decision is why Postgres almost never makes two people wait for each other. It is also why a table can quietly triple in size while holding the same amount of data, and why a 32-bit counter you have never heard of has taken real companies completely offline. Start with the update itself. Every row in a Postgres table carries two hidden columns you never asked for. They are called xmin and xmax, and you can actually select them by name if you want to see this for yourself. Xmin is the ID of the transaction that created this version of the row. Xmax is the ID of the transaction that killed it, and it sits empty for as long as the row is current. So when you run an update, Postgres does two things. It stamps Xmax on the old version, marking it dead as of your transaction. Then it writes a new version right after it, stamped with your transaction ID in xmin. Two copies of the same row now exist on disk. One is the past. One is the present. Nothing was erased. Now the part that makes it useful. When your query begins, Postgres takes a snapshot. Not a copy of your data, just a short note of which transactions had finished at that exact moment. From then on, every row version your query touches gets checked against that note. Was this version created by a transaction that had already committed when I started? Then I can see it. Was it killed by a transaction that had already committed when I started? Then I cannot. That is the whole rule. And because the old versions are still physically sitting there, your long report can keep reading the database exactly as it looked when it started, while 1,000 other people write over the top of it. You are not reading the table. You are reading the table as it was at one specific instant. This is where the famous line comes from. In Postgres, readers never block writers, and writers never block readers. A writer does not have to wait for a reader to finish, because it never touches the version the reader is looking at. It writes a new one. And this is genuinely true, but I want to be honest about the edge of it, because a lot of explanations stop one sentence too early. Two writers going after the same row do still block each other. If you update a row and do not commit, and somebody else tries to update that same row, they wait on you. There is a real row level lock there. What MVCC buys you is that reading is free. It does not repeal the laws of physics for two people editing the same record at the same moment. So what does all of this cost? Every one of those dead versions is still occupying real space on a real disk. Update the same row 1,000 times, and you have written 1,000 versions of it, 999 of which are garbage that nobody can see anymore. Postgres has a name for them. Dead tuples. And a table full of dead tuples is bigger on disk, slower to scan, and heavier in memory than the data actually justifies. That is bloat. It is the standing tax you pay for never having to wait, and if nothing cleans up after you, the bill just keeps growing. Which is why Postgres ships with a janitor. It is called Autovacuum, it runs in the background, and its job is to walk through your tables finding row versions that no living transaction could possibly still need, and marking that space reusable. Most of the time it just works and you never think about it. But here is the trap, and it is the single most common way people get hurt by this. Autovacuum can only clean up versions that are older than the oldest transaction still open anywhere in the system. One connection that opened a transaction and then went quiet, still sitting there, idle in transaction, holds the door open behind it. Every dead row from that moment forward becomes uncleanable on every table because that one sleeping session might still ask to see them. A forgotten replication slot does the same thing. The janitor is still running, it just is not allowed to throw anything away. And now the counter, which is the part that turns a housekeeping problem into an outage. Those transaction IDs stamped into every row are 32-bit numbers. 32 bits gives you about 4 billion of them, and then you are out. There is no bigger number to go to. It wraps back around to the beginning and starts handing out IDs that have been used before. Think about what that means for a row that is checked by comparing transaction IDs. A row from the distant past can suddenly look like it comes from the future and become invisible. Data that is still sitting perfectly intact on disk simply stops being returned. Postgres works around this by freezing. Vacuum goes through old rows and marks them as permanently visible, so their original transaction ID no longer matters. That is not a nice to have. That is the thing standing between you and silent data loss. So rather than let that happen, Postgres stops you. As the database gets close to running out of transaction IDs, it starts shouting in the log, from about 40 million transactions out. And if every one of those warnings gets ignored, at 3 million remaining it refuses to hand out any new transaction IDs at all. Now, be careful here, because a lot of writing on the internet gets this next part wrong, including posts that are still near the top of the search results. Postgres does not shut down. It goes read only. Your queries still run, your reads still work, Vacuum still works. What stops is anything that writes. And that is a deliberate trade. Postgres would much rather refuse your writes today than start quietly handing back wrong rows tomorrow. And this is not a thought experiment. On July 20th, 2015, the error tracking company Sentry went down for most of a US working day. And this was the reason. They were running huge, write-heavy tables. They had set the option that controls how long Postgres waits before freezing old rows far too high, and they had only 3 Autovacuum workers to do all of that freezing. Cleanup simply never caught up. Postgres reached the limit and refused further writes, exactly as it was designed to. The way it ended is the part I find extraordinary. Vacuum had finished on every table but one, a giant table that was not actually critical, and vacuuming it properly would have taken more than a day. So they truncated it. 5 minutes later, Sentry was back up. One setting on one table that nobody happened to be watching. So here's the whole thing in one line. Postgres never deletes anything on the spot. It stacks versions, shows each transaction the ones it is entitled to see, and cleans up afterwards. Nobody waits, and that is the payoff. Tables bloat, auto vacuum sweeps, and a counter has to keep being reset, and that is the price. If you want 2 things to actually watch for sessions stuck idle in transaction, and watch how old your oldest unfrozen transaction ID is getting. Both are one query away, and both are the difference between a database that quietly takes care of itself and one that stops accepting writes on a Sunday. Follow Kompile for what's under the hood.